Debt service consumed the margin that once absorbed shocks in trade, harvests, and transport. What remained was a balance sheet, unable to fund defense, infrastructure, or administration without further borrowing. The Ottoman fiscal system did not fail through sudden exhaustion. It failed through gradual compression. Debt service expanded incrementally until it occupied the functional margin of the state. Revenues that once absorbed volatility, poor harvests, disrupted trade, transport delays, regional instability, were no longer available for adjustment. They were pre-assigned. The fiscal year began with obligations already spoken for. This was not primarily a crisis of expenditure discipline. It was a balance sheet collapse. The empire's income profile became structurally incompatible with its liabilities. Ordinary revenues, customs duties, agricultural taxes, consumption levies, and monopoly rents were evaluated not for their capacity to sustain administration or investment, but for their reliability as pledged flows. Borrowing ceased to be a tool for temporary financing and became a mechanism for refinancing prior debt. Each issuance narrowed the discretionary core of governance. External debt introduced rigidity into a system built around variability. Ottoman revenues were inherently seasonal and regionally uneven. Debt service, by contrast, was fixed, scheduled, and externally enforced. When trade volumes declined or shipping was disrupted, the Treasury could not defer payment without cascading penalties. Instead, it borrowed again. Volatility, once absorbed internally, was converted into permanent obligation. This altered fiscal priorities at the structural level. Surpluses no longer functioned as buffers. They were immediately absorbed by creditors. Deficits no longer triggered internal adjustment. They triggered market dependence. The state's financial logic shifted from managing an economy to managing a balance sheet under constraint. Currency pressure followed as a secondary but compounding effect. Debt obligations denominated externally created sustained convertibility stress. Reserves that might have stabilized circulation were diverted to repayment. Monetary flexibility narrowed. The Treasury could not intervene decisively without endangering debt service. Inflationary pressure emerged not from policy excess, but from constrained monetary control operating under reserve depletion. Infrastructure spending became the first casualty of compression. Transport networks, port facilities, internal logistics, and communication systems, projects that could have expanded taxable capacity, were postponed or underfunded. These investments did not fail because they lacked justification, but because their returns lay outside the immediate horizon of debt service schedules. Fiscal logic favored predictability over growth. Capacity expansion was deferred indefinitely. Military expenditure absorbed what flexibility remained. Defense commitments could not be postponed without territorial cost. Yet military spending generated no self-liquidating return. Borrowing to fund security produced no revenue stream capable of servicing the debt incurred. Each cycle deepened imbalance. The balance sheet weakened while obligations hardened. Administrative capacity deteriorated alongside fiscal autonomy. Revenue collection systems were reorganized to satisfy creditor assurance rather than domestic efficiency. Predictable extraction mattered more than economic adaptability. This narrowed compliance, increased leakage, and reduced provincial resilience. The taxable base contracted precisely as obligations became immovable. At this stage, sovereignty still existed in form. Laws were enacted, officials were appointed, the bureaucracy functioned, but governance had become subordinate to servicing. Fiscal planning was replaced by reconciliation. Each year closed not with strategic allocation, but with accounting against liabilities already owed. The critical transformation was not insolvency, but loss of recovery capacity. A system under strain can survive shocks if it retains margin. The Ottoman balance sheet no longer did. With reserves depleted, revenues pledged, and obligations fixed, disturbance could not be absorbed. Every shock propagated directly into borrowing requirements. This was the point at which debt ceased to be a burden and became a governing condition. The empire continued to operate, but its financial architecture had lost elasticity. The margin was gone. The balance sheet could no longer heal itself. Once the balance sheet lost elasticity, control over revenue became the decisive pressure point. Creditors no longer evaluated the empire as a sovereign administrator, but as a collection mechanism. The question was not whether revenues existed, but whether they could be isolated, secured, and extracted without interference from domestic priorities. Debt service required certainty. The Ottoman fiscal system could not provide it voluntarily. Revenues fluctuated by season, region, and enforcement capacity. This mismatch triggered structural intervention. Collection was reorganized away from discretionary administration and toward fixed extraction. Revenues were no longer simply taxed. They were earmarked, pledged, and operationally separated from the state's general budget. This marked the effective foreclosure of income. Customs duties, excise taxes, and specific agricultural revenues were assigned directly to servicing obligations. These flows bypassed ordinary fiscal deliberation. They were no longer available to respond to drought, unrest, or trade disruption. The state retained nominal ownership, but not functional control. The mechanism narrowed options rapidly. When trade slowed or transport routes were disrupted, the pledged revenues did not adjust. The shortfall was absorbed elsewhere in the system: administration, maintenance, provincial support, areas already operating at minimal levels. What had once been a flexible allocation problem became a zero-sum extraction problem. This foreclosure altered internal incentives. Provincial administrators were pressured to maximize predictable yields rather than sustainable production. Collection intensity increased without corresponding reinvestment. Agricultural output stagnated. Trade responsiveness declined. Revenue predictability improved in the short term, while long-term capacity eroded. Currency pressure intensified. As more revenue streams were committed externally, the Treasury's access to liquid funds diminished. Convertibility constraints tightened. The state's ability to manage circulation weakened further. Monetary instruments could not be deployed without risking default. The financial system became reactive rather than directive. The foreclosure mechanism also distorted trade policy. Customs rates and port operations were no longer adjusted to stimulate commerce or balance imports and exports. They were calibrated to secure minimum cash flow. Trade controls prioritized reliability over competitiveness. This reduced volume, narrowed the tax base, and increased dependence on the very mechanisms that were constraining growth. Shipping constraints amplified the problem. Disruptions in maritime transport, whether from conflict, insurance costs, or route instability, translated directly into revenue shortfalls. Because pledged revenues could not flex, each disruption forced additional borrowing. Debt issuance was no longer strategic. It was compulsory. The state's remaining fiscal discretion compressed into a shrinking residual budget. What remained after foreclosure was insufficient to maintain infrastructure, administration, or social stability. Deferred maintenance accumulated. Transport inefficiencies compounded. Administrative reach weakened. Each deficiency fed back into lower economic output, further reducing unpledged revenue. At this stage, policy options converged toward a single outcome. The state could either intensify extraction from an already stressed economy or borrow to bridge gaps created by rigid servicing requirements. Both paths reduced future capacity. There was no internal lever capable of restoring balance. Governance increasingly resembled asset management under lien. Decisions were evaluated against their impact on pledged revenue streams rather than systemic resilience. Sovereignty persisted institutionally, but fiscal autonomy had been structurally subordinated. This was not collapse. It was containment. The empire continued to function within boundaries set externally by its own balance sheet. Revenue foreclosure locked the system into maintenance mode. Expansion, reform, and recovery were no longer financially actionable. The pressure now shifted from revenue control to institutional control. Once income streams were secured, the question became who would administer them permanently. Once revenue streams were foreclosed, administrative control became the remaining variable. Creditors no longer required episodic compliance, they required permanence. The problem was not whether payments could be extracted this year, but whether the mechanisms guaranteeing extraction could survive political change, regional instability, or administrative resistance. This shifted pressure from fiscal policy to institutional design. Temporary arrangements were insufficient. Revenue control had to be embedded structurally. Oversight mechanisms were introduced that operated parallel to, and increasingly independent from, the state's own fiscal organs. Collection ceased to be a sovereign function exercised by the Treasury and became a monitored process governed by external assurance. This institutional capture did not replace the Ottoman administration. It overlaid it. Existing bureaucracies continued to function, but their authority was circumscribed. Key revenue streams were removed from discretionary management and placed under permanent supervision. The state executed collection. It did not control allocation. The consequences were immediate and cumulative. Fiscal planning lost coherence because the largest and most reliable income sources no longer flowed through a unified budget. The Treasury operated on residual funds, unable to coordinate expenditure across defense, infrastructure, and administration. Planning horizons shortened. Long-term reform became financially unintelligible. This fragmentation altered internal power dynamics. Ministries competed for shrinking discretionary resources while protected revenue streams remained inaccessible. Coordination costs increased. Administrative efficiency declined not from incompetence, but from structural separation between responsibility and authority. The state was accountable for outcomes it could no longer finance. Provincial governance weakened further. Local administrators faced intensified extraction mandates without corresponding investment authority. Compliance deteriorated. Informal economies expanded. Tax resistance increased. Each adaptation reduced official revenue visibility, further justifying tighter oversight and deeper institutional intrusion. Trade systems absorbed additional strain. Ports, rail links, and internal transport corridors required maintenance to sustain volume. But capital allocation for upkeep competed with debt servicing schedules. Deferred maintenance compounded shipping constraints. Reduced throughput lowered customs receipts, reinforcing the narrative of fiscal unreliability and legitimizing continued external control. Currency stability eroded in parallel. With institutional authority over revenue weakened, confidence in monetary instruments declined. Convertibility pressure intensified. The Treasury's inability to marshal reserves or coordinate fiscal monetary response narrowed options further. Monetary policy became defensive, focused on avoiding immediate breakdown rather than restoring equilibrium. The system entered a feedback loop. Institutional capture reduced fiscal flexibility. Reduced flexibility impaired economic performance. Impaired performance validated deeper capture. Each cycle hardened constraints and narrowed exits. Importantly, this process did not require overt political domination. Formal sovereignty remained intact. Laws were passed internally. Officials were appointed domestically. Yet the financial architecture operated under external logic. Decisions that threatened revenue assurance were structurally blocked before they reached implementation. At this stage, reform initiatives faced a paradox. Any attempt to modernize administration, rationalize taxation, or stimulate trade required upfront expenditure and temporary revenue volatility. The system could not tolerate either. Reform became fiscally non-viable, regardless of political will. The empire was no longer managing decline, it was administering a fixed outcome. Institutional capture ensured continuity of extraction, but eliminated recovery pathways. The balance sheet no longer responded to policy. Policy responded to the balance sheet. What remained was a state functioning within parameters it did not set. Its institutions executed tasks, but strategic control had migrated elsewhere. Debt had progressed from obligation to infrastructure. It shaped how revenue moved, how decisions were made, and which options were permissible. The final constraint was not insolvency. It was irreversibility. Once institutions themselves enforced external priorities, reversal required capital, reserves, and coordination the system no longer possessed. The pressure now approached its terminal phase. With revenue foreclosed and institutions captured, only one question remained: how long the system could sustain itself before formal collapse followed functional loss. With institutions captured and revenues foreclosed, the remaining pressure concentrated on liquidity. The empire still generated economic activity, but it no longer retained cash long enough to deploy it. Inflows entered the system and exited almost immediately. What remained was insufficient to circulate, invest, or stabilize. Liquidity drain differed from insolvency. Insolvency implies absence. This system had presence without availability. Funds existed, but timing and control rendered them unusable. Revenues were collected on schedule, yet dispersed according to external priority. The Treasury became a pass-through entity, not a reservoir. This altered the rhythm of governance. Salaries, procurement, maintenance, and provincial transfers were delayed or rationed, not because revenues failed to arrive, but because they could not be retained. Administrative credibility weakened. Payment delays translated into informal credit, favoritism, and fragmentation. State obligations were met selectively, eroding uniform authority. Trade systems suffered accordingly. Merchants required predictable settlement and currency stability. Liquidity shortages disrupted both. Delayed payments increased transaction costs. Currency uncertainty encouraged hoarding and external settlement. Commercial activity adapted away from official channels, reducing taxable visibility and accelerating fiscal opacity. Transport infrastructure deteriorated under the same constraint. Roads, ports, and rail systems require continuous maintenance, not episodic funding. Liquidity drain converted maintenance into a discretionary expense. Deferred repairs accumulated. Transit times increased. Shipping costs rose. Volume declined. Each degradation reduced customs receipts, intensifying pressure on the remaining liquid margin. Price controls without supply compounded the problem. To contain visible stress, Authorities intervened administratively, but without liquidity to secure goods or stabilize distribution, controls distorted markets. Shortages emerged. Informal pricing replaced official rates. Enforcement consumed administrative capacity without restoring balance. Currency convertibility limits tightened as reserves thinned. The Treasury could not defend parity without jeopardizing debt service. As confidence declined, circulation velocity slowed. Economic actors preferred assets over currency. This further reduced liquidity availability, even as nominal money supply persisted. Capital immobility locked the system in place. External confidence was insufficient to attract fresh inflows without structural guarantees that further reduced autonomy. Internal capital could not mobilize at scale due to uncertainty and extraction pressure. Investment stalled. Growth options disappeared. The state's response space collapsed into triage. Each decision redistributed scarcity rather than creating capacity. Funding one function required starving another. Defense absorbed priority by necessity. Civil administration weakened. Infrastructure decayed. Social stability frayed. This was the final functional degradation. A state can survive revenue loss, institutional intrusion, or currency stress independently. It cannot survive sustained liquidity drain across all systems simultaneously. Without retained cash flow, coordination fails. Authority becomes episodic. Planning horizons shrink to weeks, then days. The empire did not yet cease to exist. Borders remained. Laws were enforced unevenly, but the machinery of governance could no longer operate continuously. It functioned in bursts, dependent on momentary availability of funds. At this stage, recovery required a liquidity reset, suspension, restructuring, or restoration of control over inflows. None were feasible within the existing architecture. Suspension risked external retaliation. Restructuring required leverage the system lacked. Restoration of control conflicted with embedded institutional constraints. Liquidity drain converted systemic weakness into terminal condition. The balance sheet no longer merely constrained policy, it extinguished operational continuity. The state was managing exhaustion, not decline. The only remaining question was not whether the system would end, but how it would be unwound, and by whom. The final stage was not marked by default alone. It was marked by the recognition that sovereignty had already been functionally liquidated. Formal declarations mattered less than the underlying arithmetic. The system no longer possessed the instruments required to reverse its own condition. By this point, debt was no longer a liability recorded on ledgers. It was infrastructure. It determined how revenue moved, how institutions operated, and how liquidity circulated, or failed to. The empire's financial architecture enforced external priority automatically, without the need for continuous intervention. Control had become systemic. The critical constraint was balance of payments pressure. External obligations required continuous outflows, while export capacity remained constrained by degraded transport, weakened trade competitiveness, and limited capital mobility. The state could not earn its way out. Each attempt to stabilize required imports, capital goods, military supplies, administrative materials that intensified outflow requirements. The balance sheet tightened with every corrective effort. Currency autonomy effectively disappeared. Convertibility limits were defensive measures, not solutions. They slowed depletion, but signaled weakness. Confidence eroded. Internal actors adjusted by externalizing value where possible. Hoarding replaced circulation. The monetary system continued to exist nominally, but its coordinating function collapsed. Debt restructuring, in theory, offered relief. In practice, leverage was absent. Reserves were depleted. Revenues were already pledged. Institutions enforcing repayment were embedded. Any unilateral adjustment threatened the remaining inflows sustaining basic operations. The cost of resistance exceeded the capacity to bear it. This is where the foreclosure metaphor reached completion. Assets had been seized not through force, but through contract. Revenue streams were encumbered. Institutions enforced extraction. Liquidity bypassed domestic use. What remained to govern was an administrative shell operating under fixed financial constraints. Territorial integrity followed financial viability, not the reverse. Defense shortfalls were not strategic failures, but funding failures. Military commitments could not be sustained without unpledged revenue. As resources thinned, territorial concessions became a fiscal outcome, not a diplomatic choice. The empire's final years were characterized by administrative continuity without strategic agency. Governance persisted, but policy no longer altered trajectories. Decisions managed decline rather than redirected it. The system had crossed from constrained sovereignty into managed dissolution. Importantly, this outcome did not require total economic exhaustion. Activity continued. Markets functioned imperfectly. Trade persisted at reduced scale. But the state's share of that activity was insufficient to reassert control. The difference between economic life and fiscal authority became absolute. What ultimately collapsed was not an empire in the dramatic sense, but a balance sheet incapable of recovery. The mechanisms of control, debt service, revenue foreclosure, institutional capture, liquidity drain had stripped the system of its adaptive capacity. Without margin, resilience vanished. Without resilience, sovereignty became procedural. The lesson is not moral and not unique. Power systems fail when they lose control over inflows relative to obligations. Debt accelerates collapse when it converts variability into rigidity and substitutes external assurance for internal flexibility. Once that conversion is complete, reversal requires resources already lost. The Ottoman case represents a complete financial autopsy. It demonstrates how sovereign debt, when layered onto a fragile revenue base and enforced through institutional embedding, can dismantle autonomy without immediate conquest. Collapse becomes administrative, then territorial, then historical. By the time the end arrived, the outcome had long been decided. What remained was execution of a process already locked in by balance sheet mechanics.